as Mass began, I prompted you to think a little about something that you now feel really competent at whenever you go to do it, that once upon a time you had no knowledge of at all. And who was it who was able to pass along that knowledge to you? Who worked with you side by side and saw that you learned this skill? I'm thinking of three in particular. They happen to intersect my life in Dominican community these last 41 years. I arrived in religious life not knowing a lot of things that I needed to be taught about religious life, but I did enter with the skill of how to paint. You know why? My dad knew how to paint. Now, he wasn't really that much of a handyman. So lots of times, one of the neighbors came over and did some repair thing, or we just hired it out. But he did know how to paint. We were a family of 5 kids and 2 parents and a dog. And so the walls took a little bit of a beating. But painting's really not that hard. And it's not very expensive. It's one of the cheapest ways to make a place look better. And when you take on a vow of poverty, and especially when you're new to a place and it's not your job to make the budget, one quick way to make an impact, well, first, you don't paint until you've washed the walls. So my mom visited here one time, and it was really dirty back in 1990 when I lived here. And I just told her, I said, well, we just don't have very much money. I remember her saying, soap and water doesn't cost much. So first you wash the walls, let them dry, pick out the paint, and then the rest of it I learned from my dad. It's just not that hard. Be careful. He couldn't resist saying, you missed a spot, because he was kind of smart alecky. Don't you hate that in people, Manny, when they're smart alecky? But I know how to paint. I know how to cook. This week, on my turn, I made chili from my dad's recipe. He used to make fun of me. Well, it was just a running joke after I left home at 18. Whenever I'd call home, he'd say, did you get my letter? No, Dad, I guess it's in the mail. He never wrote a letter. Never, ever in his life. But he always would say, did you get my letter? And I'd say, no, but it's probably coming tomorrow. But when I went into my first year as a student, I was one of 14 in the community. We were all thrown together, and it was a brand new experiment. And we didn't have a cook. We were all going to have to cook whether we knew how or not. Well, I thought, I've never made Dad's chili, but maybe if he gave me the recipe, I could do it. And it's kind of the way I remember it, because some things are measured, and other things just say, chop up some bell pepper and throw it in. But I know how to make chili. When I was at St. Albert's, our headquarters, there were probably about 50 people that lived in that house. And at that time, there were sisters from Germany that did the cooking much of the time. They had survived the Second World War, and they survived the years of near starvation afterwards if you were living in blown-up Germany. They never had the ability to just go buy stuff. They just had to work with what was on hand and figure out how to make it work. One of the ways, I wasn't really invited to cook with them so much as to set tables. When 50 people live in the same house, you never go more than a few days in a row without it being somebody's birthday. There was always a birthday. Or there would be some seasonal feast, because we keep track of stuff like Saints' Days. Not just the big days either. There was always a reason to celebrate somebody something. That meant having to set a nice table. So Sisters Nicolina and Sophie taught me how to go out into the yard and see what God provided. And it didn't mean go and pluck all the nicest roses off the bushes. It meant dig around in the ditches and find some little forlorn thing that could be turned into a part of the way to set the table. I remember being at my sister's house in Oregon once, and we had this set of china that my parents had bought, and it had, you know what wisteria looks like? It's purple and it's clustered. Sort of the bloom of it looks a little bit like grapes in a bunch. And I went out into the yard because that's what I was taught to do. When you want to set a nice table, you go out into the yard and look and see what's there. And in the ditches, there was this weed that grew in Oregon that had these purple clusters of some little odd berry in it. You wouldn't want to eat it, but you don't eat the centerpiece. But I made a beautiful table out of junk that was out in the yard, stuff that was just a weed, because I'd been taught how to do that. Today, Jesus gives an image that is from the Old Testament, it's from Sirach, of getting in the yoke. You know, a yoke of oxen, or the harnesses that might make several horses pull a stagecoach, something like that. Making animals work together to pull a load that no one of them alone could have done. Well, that image was already an Old Testament image. It was in the people's spiritual psyche that God had used this image before to say, I'd be happy to teach you if you'll get in the yoke with me. So it's not being taught from on high or even by a teacher at the front of the class. It's being taught by a mentor, shoulder to shoulder with you. Maybe more like in a university setting, more like what happened in a lab than in a lecture, where you might be working with somebody that knows more about the topic who's right there next to you in the experiment. Jesus says to us today, come to me, all of you who find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Well, who on earth doesn't find life burdensome right about now? For crying out loud. Even things that you are good at and you are competent at, you're having to do them in ways you never did them before. Teachers who've taught their whole career suddenly having to Zoom all their classes, like that's just a skill you pick up overnight. There are just so many things that seem so laborious. I'm a preacher who can't go out and preach in front of live crowds, so I've been learning all kind of online everything, just the same way everybody else is trying to make this all work. Come to me, all of you who find life burdensome, and I'll give you rest. Now here's an important part. Take my yoke upon your shoulders and learn from me. That's important, because you and I might have our morning routines all set, and we might be kind of on autopilot while we're getting our coffee. The way that you start the day and move into your day's work, you might have kind of had that grooved and you don't even give it a thought. I think what the scriptures suggest to us is, wait a minute, you might be about to put your own yoke on your shoulders. You might just be inclined to do things the same old way, the way you've always done them, and then feel burdened and worn out, unappreciated, exhausted. Take my yoke on your shoulder and learn from me. I'll refresh you. So I'd like to suggest that whatever your morning routine is, however you start the day, especially during this pandemic that doesn't show any signs of going away anytime soon, maybe added to your morning routine is an explicit prayer saying, hey, Jesus, I would like to get in your yoke instead of asking you to get in mine, because yours might be easier than the one that I routinely strap myself into. Do you think you could remember to do that? Or at least try it out? Hey, Jesus, I'd like to get in your yoke rather than get in my own. Your tasks might be pretty much the same, although they could shift over time. But the attitude toward them could change if you say, hey, I'd like to do this your way. I find that when I do that, I remember that there's really only one thing the Lord asks of us day in, day out, good times and bad, sickness and health, death do us part. You know it. Just love. Receive love, give love. Receive love, give love. Breathe in, breathe out, repeat. It's just that simple. So it just could be in this moment, the Lord, this passage that's been sitting there for a really long time, it might just be that it's time to pick this one up and apply it and say to the Lord, before I even have a chance to take up my work today under my own power and wear myself out and get crabby with the people around me because I'm so tired, what if I got in your yoke and worked beside you? You could either teach me to do something I didn't know how to do, preach by Zoom, or you could teach me to do the thing I thought I already knew how to do, but do it in your own way. There might be a way that I could use my imagination and find a new path that makes things easier and lighter, not just for me, but for everyone around me.